The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Library in soft, honeyed streaks, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars in the hushed air. Madison Chen stood at the circulation desk, perfectly still, watching the particles float through the silence she had cultivated so carefully over the past 4 years. She wore her usual uniform of muted colors. Today, a soft grey cardigan over a cream blouse, and her dark hair was pinned back in a neat bun that hadn't moved since 7 o'clock that morning. Everything about her was intentional. Everything was in its place. This was what she loved about arriving at the library before opening time. The silence was so complete, it had texture. It had weight. You could almost feel it pressing gently against your eardrums, a kind reminder that the world could be ordered and calm if you just paid attention to the details. Madison moved through the stacks with the grace of someone who had walked these rows thousands of times. She adjusted a book that was half an inch too far to the left. She smoothed her hand across a table where someone had left a water ring yesterday, thoroughly cleaned, but the muscle memory of imperfection still bothered her. The library was her domain, her meditation, her small corner of control in a world that had spent the last decade refusing to cooperate with her plans. At 32 years old, Madison had learned to find contentment in small victories. A perfectly organized non-fiction section. A patron who actually whispered instead of using their normal speaking voice. A day when nobody spilled coffee on the ancient carpets. These were the things that made life meaningful. The doors opened at 9 o'clock sharp, and Madison was ready. She had arranged the new arrivals display exactly as she wanted it, spine out for maximum visual impact. The computer systems hummed quietly. The return bin was empty. The world was in harmony. By 9:30, 3 patrons had arrived, mostly regulars who understood the fundamental rules of library conduct. Mrs. Patterson, who came every Tuesday and Thursday to read the newspaper. Mr. Kowalski, who spent entire afternoons in the local history section researching his family tree. And Sophie, a college student who actually studied and never ever made noise. Madison was helping Mrs. Patterson locate a book about, ironically, stress reduction when she heard it. The sound came from upstairs in the mezzanine section, loud enough to echo down through the exposed wooden beams that had been part of the original 1927 building. It was a man's voice. Not just speaking, laughing. A big, unrestrained, echoing laugh that bounced off the skylights and down into the quiet sanctuary below. "Oh, come on, Derek. That can't be the actual estimate. Did you use a broken calculator? You might as well have hired a chimpanzee with a spreadsheet." Madison's eyes widened by approximately 0%. But internally, her entire nervous system triggered an alarm that would have made a smoke detector look relaxed. She held up one finger to Mrs. Patterson, a gesture that meant, "One moment, please remain stationary," and moved with purpose toward the stairs. She did not hurry. Madison Chen did not hurry. But there was a certain intensity to her stride, a straightness in her spine, a tightening around her mouth that suggested she was a woman on a mission. The mezzanine was quieter than the main floor, dominated by the reference section and several tables for serious research. Curled up in one of the wingback chairs, barely visible behind a copy of Architectural Digest, was a man. He was sprawled across the chair like he owned it, one leg hooked over the armrest, his free hand gesturing expressively at his phone. "I don't care if your cousin's nephew did construction work one summer. This is a professional job." He paused, apparently listening to something the person on the other end of the call was saying. Then, "What do you mean, how hard can it be? That's not... Okay, you know what, we'll talk about this later. I have to..." Madison cleared her throat. The man looked up, and even though she was prepared for him to be inconsiderate, unprepared for the utter lack of library consciousness that would be required to take a phone call in the mezzanine of a public library, she was not prepared for what she actually saw. He was approximately 35 years old, with the kind of effortlessly tousled dark hair that suggested he didn't own a comb and had never considered owning one. His face had the bone structure of someone who belonged in a different era, all sharp angles and unexpected softness. His eyes were a shade of brown that managed to be both warm and mischievous simultaneously, and right now they were looking at her with the expression of someone who had just realized he was being observed doing something he shouldn't have been doing, but who remained fundamentally unbothered by this realization. He was wearing a charcoal button-down shirt that had been expensive at some point in its life, now wrinkled and with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that suggested he did more with his hands than make phone calls about spreadsheets. His jeans looked like they'd been purchased specifically to look like they were falling apart, and his shoes, Salvatore Ferragamo loafers, Madison noted with some confusion, were scuffed in a way that suggested they'd spent more time at actual job sites than in actual offices. "Hey," he said, holding up the phone, "I'm just gonna—" "You're in a library," Madison said. Her voice was quiet. She had spent 4 years developing the precise tone required to communicate disapproval without actually raising her voice. It was a skill that could cut through a room like a laser through butter. "We ask that you keep conversations outside, or at minimum, keep your voice to what we call a library voice." The man stared at her for a moment. Madison watched his face cycle through several expressions: confusion, amusement, and then, most troubling of all, a kind of charming resignation that suggested he had been told to use his inside voice by mothers, teachers, and probably his own grandmother. "Library voice," he repeated. He spoke into the phone. "Derek, I'm gonna have to call you back. I'm being shushed, aggressively shushed, by someone with very judgmental energy." He ended the call and stood up, which meant Madison had to revise her previous height estimation upward significantly. He was tall, 6'2" or 3", with the kind of posture that suggested someone who was comfortable taking up space in the world. "I sincerely apologize for the disturbance," he said, and he said it in a way that suggested he was genuinely contrite while also being deeply entertained by the entire situation. "I'll take my extremely loud presence and my apparently offensive phone energy downstairs to the main floor, where I will whisper like a man who has learned his lesson." He moved past her toward the stairs, with the confidence of someone who had already forgotten he'd done anything wrong. Madison watched him go, her jaw tight. She could feel her heartbeat returning to normal, the adrenaline of having to enforce library policy beginning to drain from her system. This was always the worst part: the interaction, the confrontation, the exhausting requirement to make people understand that shared spaces required shared respect for boundaries. She stood there for a moment longer, making sure the mezzanine was suitably quiet once more, then returned downstairs to assist Mrs. Patterson. But she found herself distracted, because the man had settled into a table on the main floor, a table positioned in clear view of the circulation desk, and he had opened his laptop, and every few minutes his fingers would still and his shoulders would shake with what appeared to be suppressed laughter, as if the incident on the mezzanine was the most amusing thing that had happened to him all week. Madison tried to focus on helping patrons. A child asked for books about dinosaurs. Mr. Kowalski needed assistance navigating the genealogy database. Sophie required printing assistance, all routine, all manageable, all completely undermined by the fact that every time Madison glanced toward the work tables, the man was there, wearing an expression of profound concentration that was obviously paper-thin disguise over active amusement. By 1 o'clock, she had helped 47 patrons and had not once acknowledged his existence. This was her strategy. Ignoring people who violated library etiquette often encouraged them to leave. The library was not a coffee shop. It was not an office space. It was a place of study and silence and reasonable behavior. Around 1:15 he stood up, packed his laptop with the kind of careful efficiency that suggested he actually respected the equipment he owned, and approached the circulation desk. Madison was cataloging returns, her fingers moving with practiced precision across the keyboard. "Hey," he said, and his voice was the correct volume now, a normal speaking voice, which in a library environment qualified as essentially shouting. "I wanted to apologize again about earlier. I get focused on work stuff and I forget where I am. It's a character flaw." Madison looked up. "It's not a character flaw," she said carefully. "It's a lack of awareness. Character flaws are less fixable. Lack of awareness just requires a little attention to your environment." He grinned. It was the kind of grin that explained why he felt comfortable being loud in libraries. It was the grin of someone who believed that charm could solve most problems and had enough data to suggest he was usually right. "Okay, noted. I'll work on my environmental awareness." He paused. "I'm Lucas, by the way." "Madison," she said, turning back to her cataloguing. "And thank you for keeping your voice down for the rest of your visit." "Oh, I'm not actually leaving," Lucas said, and there was something in his tone that made Madison pause her finger on the keyboard. "I actually need to talk to you about something kind of important." Madison looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. This was a tone she recognized, the tone of someone about to ask if there were any exceptions to the library's policies. If he asked about having a friend visit, and they could maybe talk a little louder, she was going to have to educate him about the fundamental concept of public institutions. "The library's rules are non-negotiable," she said preemptively. "I understand that some people find silence challenging, but that's what we're here to provide. If you need a different kind of environment for your work, there are several coffee shops." "No, it's not about that," Lucas said. He leaned against the desk in a way that would have made Madison physically move away if she were the type of person to physically move away from things. "I'm actually here to talk to you about the building. I'm the new owner. I purchased the property 3 weeks ago, and I wanted to introduce myself and discuss some potential renovations." Madison experienced a moment of dissonance so complete it was almost physical. She stared at him. Then she slowly set down her cataloguing pen. "I'm sorry," she said. "Could you repeat that?" "I'm the new owner of the building," Lucas said. He pulled out his phone and showed her what appeared to be property documents. "I know the previous owner didn't communicate this very clearly. He's kind of a chaos agent. But I closed on the property about 3 weeks ago. I'm still working on some preliminary assessments, but I wanted to start talking to the tenants about what their needs are. I want to make sure renovations are done in a way that respects the existing community." Madison's mind was doing something that felt somewhat like buffering. She had spent the last 4 years working in this library, and somehow, the building had changed hands without her knowledge. The library occupied the first 2 floors, and the mezzanine of the historic 5-story Riverside building, which had been subdivided into various commercial and office spaces over the past 50 years. "Who owns the building's property management company?" she asked, in the tone of someone who was beginning to suspect she had been profoundly unaware of something important. "I do," Lucas said. "I bought it directly from the previous owner, James Carmichael. He'd owned it for about 15 years, but he decided to liquidate some properties." Madison processed this information with the kind of focus usually reserved for solving complex research queries. She had come to this library 4 years ago because it was a good position with a reasonable salary and a patron base that mostly respected boundaries. She had not at any point considered that the building itself might change ownership without notification. "Does my management company know about this?" she asked. "They should," Lucas said. "The property management company I retained sent notification letters to all tenants last month." Madison did not remember receiving any such letter. Madison, however, also knew that she had been traveling to visit her parents at approximately that time, and sometimes mail got mixed up. This was the kind of administrative oversight that would normally frustrate her, but was beginning to explain several things, including why a maintenance issue she'd reported to the previous landlord 3 weeks ago had never been addressed. "All right," Madison said, maintaining her composure with the kind of effort that usually required an engineering degree. "What kind of renovations are you considering?" "Structural assessments first," Lucas said. "Building this old, we need to make sure everything's up to code. then probably some cosmetic updates. Fresh paint, maybe refinishing the original hardwood under the existing carpet in the library area, that kind of thing. But I want to work with you to make sure any construction doesn't disrupt your operations. Despite her ongoing sense of profound disorientation, Madison felt something in her chest relax slightly. This man, this loud, boundary-violating man who had taken phone calls in the reference section, apparently understood that a library's primary function was to provide uninterrupted access to research and materials. "I appreciate that," she said. "We have patrons who depend on consistent access. Any construction would need to be scheduled during off hours or in sections of the building not adjacent to the library." "Absolutely," Lucas said. "Would you be free sometime this week to walk through the building with me? I want to get a sense of what needs to be done, and I'd like your input as someone who actually uses the space daily." Madison considered this. She considered the fact that this man was her new landlord, which meant he was in a position of authority over her workplace. She considered the fact that he'd spent the morning being loud and inconsiderate. She considered the fact that he was now being helpful and respectful and seemingly genuine. "Thursday," she said finally, "after we close, at 6 o'clock, I can show you the library spaces." "Thursday at 6, Lucas confirmed. He smiled again, and this time Madison recognized it as a genuine expression rather than a charming deflection. "Thanks, Madison. I think we're going to be a great team." As he left, at a normal volume, still respecting the library's quiet, Madison returned to her cataloging with a sense that something fundamental in her carefully ordered world had shifted. The building was new ownership. There would be changes, and she would have to work with a man who found silence challenging and apparently found her rigid adherence to rules deeply entertaining. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly. Thursday arrived with the kind of autumn weather that made Portland look like it had been specifically designed for contemplative people. The sky was a soft gray that didn't quite commit to rain, and the air carried the scent of wet leaves and approaching evening. Madison had changed clothes after her shift, a minor deviation from her usual routine, though she told herself this was simply because showing a building to its new owner required a more professional appearance than her everyday cardigan and sensible shoes combination. She now wore dark jeans that she actually owned but rarely wore, paired with a cream silk blouse and a structured black blazer that had been hanging in her closet for approximately 2 years, waiting for an occasion that justified its existence. Her hair was still in its bun, but she'd loosened it slightly, allowing a few strands to escape in what she recognized, with some embarrassment, as an intentional aesthetic choice. At 5:58, Lucas arrived at the library's front entrance. He was wearing jeans and a forest green sweater with a grey wool coat, and he looked like someone who had woken up that morning and selected clothing without any particular thought to the process. This was somehow more impressive than someone who had clearly invested effort. "Hey," he said, pushing through the glass doors, "thanks for making time for this." "Of course," Madison said, with the kind of professional courtesy usually reserved for business interactions with people who weren't landlords. The building was constructed in 1927 by the Riverside Development Company. It's one of the few remaining examples of classical revival architecture in this part of Portland. She had, Madison realized with some surprise, spent approximately 45 minutes on Wednesday evening reading the building's historical documentation. This was not unusual behavior for her. Madison was inclined toward thorough research. But the intensity with which she'd conducted this particular research suggested something beyond academic curiosity. 1927. Lucas repeated, looking up at the soaring ceiling of the main library floor. The ceiling was coffered wood, original to the building, with brass light fixtures that had been installed during the Roosevelt administration. "That's incredible. Do you know what kind of wood this is?" "Heart pine," Madison said. "They don't use it anymore because the old-growth trees are gone. The building was constructed during a time when craftsmanship was, She stopped herself. She was, she realized, beginning to lecture. "I apologize. I have a tendency to become enthusiastic about architectural history." "Don't apologize," Lucas said. He was still looking at the ceiling, his expression one of genuine wonder. "This is exactly the kind of information I need. See, most people just see a building. You see the craftsmanship, that's valuable." They began the tour on the library's main floor. Madison had cleaned and organized everything with extra care. Not for Lucas, she told herself, but because one should always keep one's workplace in optimal condition. She showed him the circulation desk, the stacks, the reference section. She explained the layout, the patron flow patterns, the areas that experienced the most stress. What surprised her was how knowledgeable Lucas was. He asked intelligent questions about structural load, about how weight distributed through the ceiling beams, about whether she'd experienced any water damage or settling issues. He took photographs with his phone, made notes in a small leather notebook that he pulled from his jacket pocket. "The mezzanine access," he said, moving toward the stairs. "Is that original to the building?" "The stairs are original," Madison confirmed, following him. "But the mezzanine itself was added in the 1950s when the library expanded. The original layout was just the main floor." As they climbed, Madison found herself hyper-aware of Lucas's presence in a way that was both irritating and difficult to ignore. The stairwell was narrow, built in an era when people apparently took up less space, and she could smell his cologne, something woodsy and understated that suggested he hadn't chosen it specifically for this interaction. The mezzanine was quiet at this hour, just beginning to transition from the grey afternoon light into the softer light of approaching evening. The reference section was arranged in the way Madison preferred, logical, organized, with clear sightlines. "This is where I was being aggressively shushed," Lucas said, and there was laughter in his voice. "This is where you were violating basic library protocol," Madison corrected, but she said it with a slight smile that she hoped was not visible but probably was. Lucas turned to look at her. "You know, I've been thinking about that," he said. "About how you handled it. You were right, I was being disruptive, but you were also kind of amazing about it. Like you didn't make me feel like an asshole. You just made me understand that I was being an asshole, which is different, it's respectful." Madison did not know how to respond to this. She was not accustomed to having her boundary setting praised. She was more accustomed to people being defensive or dismissive or acting like her need for quiet was somehow a personal attack on their right to exist loudly. "I try to approach behavioral corrections as information sharing rather than punishment," she said carefully. "Most people don't intentionally violate library etiquette. They're just unaware." "See?" Lucas gestured at her. "That's exactly what I mean. You're like library diplomacy. It's a whole thing." They continued upward to the second floor, which housed the library's administrative offices and staff areas. This was Madison's territory. Her desk was here, along with the desks of 2 other full-time librarians and 3 part-time staff members. Her desk was, as always, immaculately organized. Her computer monitor was clean. Her supplies were arranged by size and frequency of use. Lucas looked around with the kind of assessment that suggested he was evaluating the space as a landlord rather than as a guest. "Do you have adequate climate control?" he asked. "Enough electrical outlets? Any issues with the HVAC system?" "The climate control is adequate, though it can be inconsistent near the windows during winter," Madison said. "We have sufficient outlets, and the HVAC makes an unusual grinding sound sometimes, particularly in the northeastern corner of the building." Lucas made a note. "I'll have someone come inspect that. Could be the bearings in the compressor. Shouldn't be a big repair, but I'd rather catch it before it becomes a problem." As they moved through the second floor, Madison found herself relaxing slightly. Lucas was asking relevant questions, taking the building's condition seriously, treating the space with respect. He was, in fact, being incredibly thoughtful about the entire situation. "Can we see the 3rd floor?" he asked. "I haven't been up there yet." "The third floor is offices," Madison said. "Various businesses rent spaces up there. An accounting firm, a graphic design studio, a couple of small tech companies. We probably shouldn't disturb them at this hour." "Right, of course," Lucas said. He moved toward the main stairs instead of the secondary staircase. "I'll coordinate with them separately." As they climbed to the third floor, Lucas was quiet in a way that suggested he was thinking about something. Madison found herself studying him slightly, the way his hand ran along the banister, the set of his shoulders, the expression of focused concentration on his face. "Can I ask you something?" he said, as they reached the third-floor landing. "And you can tell me to mind my own business because I respect boundaries. I've learned from my mistakes." "Yes?" Madison said, uncertain where this was going. "Why a library?" he asked. "Like, you're clearly intelligent, organized, capable. You could probably do anything. What made you choose to work in a library?" This was not a question Madison was prepared for. She had expected him to ask something about building systems or maintenance schedules. Instead, he was asking about the fundamental choices that had led her to this point in her life. "Libraries preserve knowledge," she said finally. "They make information accessible to people who might not otherwise have access. And they provide space for quiet reflection in a world that's increasingly loud and demanding. I like being part of that. I like being part of something that helps people." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "That's a really good answer," he said. "I mean, not in a condescending way, in a that's genuinely compelling way." They reached the fourth floor, which housed the offices that Lucas apparently now owned. The elevator, a small, ancient affair that clearly predated most of the building's renovations, creaked its way upward with the kind of sound that suggested it was held together primarily through optimism. "That elevator is a safety concern," Lucas said, making notes. "It's going to need either a complete overhaul or replacement." They explored the remaining floors, including the roof access, which provided a panoramic view of Portland. The city was beginning to light up as evening settled in, and the sky had taken on that particular shade of blue-gray that preceded twilight. "This is beautiful," Lucas said, looking out over the cityscape. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the smell of rain and the faint sound of traffic from the streets below. "I didn't realize how much of the city you could see from up here." Madison stood beside him, maintaining approximately 2 feet of distance, a measurement she had not consciously calculated but had apparently determined appropriate for the situation. "The previous owner didn't maintain roof access for tenants," she said, "but the views are quite spectacular." "We should change that," Lucas said. "Maybe create a rooftop space, garden, seating area, somewhere people could come to think or relax." Madison considered this. The idea of a rooftop garden appealed to her, the order of it, the way such a space would need to be maintained, the quiet utility of it. "That would be nice," she said. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city transition into evening. Madison found herself aware of how close Lucas was standing, how the wind was moving his hair, how his expression was soft and contemplative in a way that made him look different from the loud, boundary-violating man who had laughed in the mezzanine. "Thank you for showing me all this," Lucas said finally. "I know this wasn't your plan for the evening, and I appreciate you taking the time." "Of course," Madison said. "It's your building. I should have been more welcoming when I found out about the ownership change." "You weren't unwelcoming," Lucas said. He turned to look at her. "You were exactly as welcoming as someone should be to the loud guy who was disrupting her library, which is to say minimally welcoming but with room for improvement, which is fair." Madison found herself smiling despite herself. "You've been an adequate landlord so far," she said. "Adequate," Lucas repeated. "I'm going to take that as a major compliment coming from you." Indeed, as they made their way back down through the building, switching off lights and locking doors, Madison felt something settle in her chest, a kind of acceptance that this man was now part of her professional landscape, that her carefully ordered world now included the possibility of his presence in it, By the time they reached the library's front entrance, full darkness had fallen. The building's exterior lights had automatically switched on, creating pools of amber illumination on the sidewalk. "Can I buy you dinner?" Lucas asked abruptly. "Like, as a thank you, or as a getting-to-know-my-tenants kind of thing. Nothing weird, just food." Madison's instinct was to decline. She had plans, or rather she had the absence of plans, which she intended to spend organizing her personal library and reading. But something in her recognized that declining would be mean. And Lucas had been considerate during their entire tour. "There's a restaurant 2 blocks from here," she said. "They have good vegetarian options." "I'm actually vegetarian too," Lucas said. "I just don't usually advertise it because people get weird about it." "I've never understood that reaction," Madison said. "It's a dietary preference, not a religious conversion." They walked to the restaurant in companionable silence, and Madison found herself thinking that this evening had not gone at all the way she had anticipated, which was, she was beginning to realize, becoming something of a pattern with Lucas Webb. The restaurant was warm and softly lit, with exposed brick and wooden tables worn smooth by years of use. They ordered. Lucas got the portobello mushroom risotto. Madison ordered the roasted vegetable pasta and settled into a booth near the back. "So tell me about yourself," Lucas said after their water glasses had been filled. "Like the actual you, not the library version." Madison considered this. "I'm not sure those are different people," she said. "My work is fairly central to my identity." "Okay, but what did you do before you worked at the library? What made you want to become a librarian?" Madison leaned back in her booth, looking at him. He was genuinely interested. She could tell because his eyes were focused on her rather than on the menu or the surroundings. This was, she was beginning to realize, one of his qualities. He had a capacity for presence that was somewhat rare. "I grew up in a small town in Iowa," she said. "My parents still live there. The public library was the only place that didn't feel like people were expecting something from me. I could just exist and explore information at my own pace." "What were people expecting from you?" Lucas asked. This was not a question she usually answered. But the dim lighting and the warm soup that had just been delivered seemed to create an atmosphere that encouraged honesty. "I was the second of 5 children," Madison said. "My older brother was the successful one. He's a surgeon. My younger siblings were all very social, very involved in school activities. I was the quiet one, the bookish one. And there was this pressure to figure out what I was going to do with my intelligence, as if being intelligent required a specific life trajectory. And librarianship felt like resistance to that." "Librarianship felt like choice," Madison corrected. "I wasn't becoming a librarian because it was expected. I was becoming a librarian because it was what I wanted." Lucas listened to this with an expression of genuine interest. "That makes sense," he said. "I did something similar, actually. My family expected me to take over my father's business. He's in finance, very corporate, very structured. And I went into construction specifically because it was different, because it was working with my hands, seeing concrete results." "Are you good at it?" Madison asked. "At construction?" "At whatever you're doing with it." Lucas smiled. "I'm decent," he said. "I've had some successes, some failures. Right now I'm in that phase where I'm trying to build something sustainable rather than just trying to prove a point to my father. Buying the building was part of that. I wanted to do something that mattered to the community, that preserved something historic." They talked for nearly 2 hours. Madison learned that Lucas had grown up in Seattle, that he had a younger sister who was an architect, that he'd briefly considered law school before realizing he was more interested in how buildings worked than how laws worked. Lucas learned that Madison had spent 2 years trying to be an academic librarian before realizing she preferred working directly with patrons, that she had learned to cook as a way of channeling her need for structure and precision into something creative, that she had very strong opinions about organizational systems. By the time they finished dinner and walked back to the library building, Madison felt something she hadn't felt in quite some time, a sense of genuine connection with another person. Not romantic connection. She wasn't entirely sure she was capable of that, but something real and substantive. "Thank you for dinner," she said as they reached her car in the library's parking lot, "and for the tour. It was informative. Thank you for being willing to work with me on the building," Lucas said. "I have a feeling you're going to be an invaluable resource." Madison drove home through the quiet streets of Portland, thinking about structural integrity and what it meant to have something solid to build upon. By the time she reached her apartment, she had almost convinced herself that the evening had been simply pleasant, nothing more. Professional, even. Almost. The first sign that Madison's carefully ordered world was about to become significantly more complicated came on a Monday morning at 6:45, approximately 2 hours before the library was scheduled to open. She arrived at Riverside Library to find a construction dumpster in the parking lot, a white van with the words "Web Construction and Renovation" painted across its side, and Lucas standing in the library's entrance wearing a dust mask and holding what appeared to be architectural blueprints. "Morning," he said, pulling the mask down around his neck. "I know this is earlier than we discussed, but the HVAC team had an opening today, and I didn't want to wait. They should be done by 1 o'clock, which means we'll only have about a 3-hour disruption during business hours." Madison stared at him. She had, over the past 2 weeks, become accustomed to seeing Lucas approximately 3 times weekly. He would arrive at the library ostensibly to check on various building systems or to consult with her about renovation timelines. In reality, and she had come to suspect that Lucas knew this, he would spend his time finding reasons to extend conversations about architectural details, asking her opinions about paint colors and flooring options, or mentioning restaurants he thought she might enjoy. What she had not become accustomed to was the sudden reality of actual construction. 3 hours, she repeated. "During business hours, Lucas, we have patrons who depend on access to the library. We have research projects, online databases, people who use the computers." "I know," Lucas said, and he seemed genuinely contrite. "But the HVAC system affects climate control, which affects patron comfort and equipment integrity. And the assessment showed that the northeastern unit is failing faster than we thought. If we wait much longer, we could have a system shutdown during winter, which would be much more disruptive." Madison took a breath. He was right. She knew he was right. But right did not make the situation any less fundamentally chaotic. "How many people will be in the building?" she asked. 4 technicians, plus me," Lucas said. "They'll be working primarily in the mechanical room, which is in the basement, but they'll need to access the main floor and the second floor to run new ductwork through existing infrastructure. It's going to be loud." Loud. Of course it was going to be loud. The universe apparently had a sense of humor about the fact that she had spent the last week organizing her schedule around avoiding unnecessary noise, only to have the universe decide that necessary noise was the order of the day. "What time will they arrive?" Madison asked, moving into strategic planning mode. 7:30, Lucas said. "They want to start before business hours technically begin, to minimize disruption." "We open at 9 o'clock, Madison said, "which means they have 90 minutes to prepare people who come in early for research purposes. I need to call the main patrons who have standing Monday appointments. I need to post signs. "I'll help," Lucas said. "Whatever you need. This is my responsibility. I'll take the administrative burden off you." What followed was 90 minutes of controlled chaos that was somehow less chaotic than Madison had feared. Primarily because Lucas proved to be extraordinarily competent at managing both the construction crew and the logistics of notifying patrons. He called the 3 people who had standing Monday morning appointments while Madison prepared notification emails. He helped her print signs and place them at all building entrances. He physically accompanied the first crew members to show them the mechanical room layout. apparently having already consulted with the building's original blueprints to understand the most efficient access routes. By 8:45, the library was as prepared as it could be. By 9 o'clock, when Madison unlocked the front doors, the HVAC work had begun in earnest. The noise was, it must be said, significant. It was a grinding, whirring sound that seemed to originate from beneath the floorboards and vibrate up through the structural bones of the building. It was not constant. It would reach a crescendo, then pause for a few seconds, then begin again. It was the kind of noise that made concentration difficult and quiet reflection essentially impossible. Madison had prepared for this. She had reserved the meeting room on the second floor, a space with better sound insulation for patrons who needed quiet study space. She had created a computer lab station in the back corner of the library, where the noise was slightly diminished. She had printed signs directing people to these alternative spaces. What she had not fully prepared for was the psychological impact of watching her sanctuary be violated by construction debris, dust covers over certain sections of the building, and the general disarray that accompanied renovation work. By 10 o'clock, she was managing. By 11 o'clock, she was stressed but functional. By 12 o'clock, she was sitting at the circulation desk with a tension headache that was beginning to feel like a permanent addition to her skull. That's when Lucas appeared with 2 coffee cups from the cafe downstairs and an expression of genuine concern. "How are you holding up?" he asked, setting one of the coffees on the desk. "Fine," Madison said, which was the kind of obvious lie that even someone unfamiliar with her generally honest demeanor would recognize as untrue. "It's louder than I expected." "It is," Lucas agreed. He sat on the edge of the desk, which Madison would normally have corrected him for doing, but she was too emotionally depleted to care about furniture etiquette. "And it's going to be loud for another hour, minimum, which is why I'm suggesting something." Madison looked up from her coffee. "Come with me," Lucas said. "Take a break. Leave someone in charge. You have other staff, right?" 2 part-time staff members, Madison said slowly. "Elena and David. But I can't just leave." "You can," Lucas said. "You can absolutely leave. Managers take breaks. It's not just allowed, it's necessary. Come on, 30 minutes fresh air, away from the noise." Madison's instinct was to refuse. The library needed her. There were patrons who required assistance. There was a circulation desk that required staffing. But another part of her, a part that had been increasingly vocal over the past 2 weeks, recognized that she was experiencing burnout and that 30 minutes away from the grinding HVAC machinery might be the difference between managing the situation and completely unraveling. 30 minutes, she said finally. "I'll tell Elena I'm taking a break." They left through the back entrance, emerging into the mild autumn afternoon. The weather had cleared, and Portland was displaying the kind of crisp, clear weather that made people forget that it rained approximately 300 days per year. The park across the street from the library was filled with people taking advantage of the sunshine. People sitting on benches, people walking dogs, people just existing outside in a way that Madison realized she rarely did during work hours. Lucas led her to a small coffee shop that Madison had always meant to explore, but never had. It was tucked into a historic building similar to Riverside, with exposed brick and tall windows, and the kind of aesthetic that suggested someone had invested significant thought into the design. "Sit," Lucas instructed, pointing to a small table near the window. "I'm getting you something with sugar. You look like you need carbohydrates." He returned with 2 pastries, a chocolate croissant for Madison and what appeared to be a berry tart for himself. They sat in silence for a few minutes, during which Madison could feel the stress literally draining from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said finally. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." "You do this to yourself, don't you?" Lucas asked. It wasn't unkind, just observational. "You push until you're completely depleted, and then you're surprised when you need to recover." "I'm efficient," Madison said. "I accomplish more when I'm focused." "You're driving yourself into early burnout," Lucas corrected. But again, it was gentle. "And I'm partially responsible because I made the decision to start the HVAC work without thinking about the impact on your mental health." "You were thinking about the building's health," Madison said, "which is valid." "Both things can be valid," Lucas said. "And I should have consulted with you more thoroughly before scheduling. I'm sorry." Madison found herself studying him as he ate his tart. He had dust on his sweater, actual construction dust, and his hair was slightly disheveled from having removed a dust mask. He looked, in fact, like someone who had been doing physical work, not just supervising it, which Madison was beginning to realize was probably exactly what he'd been doing. "Have you eaten anything today?" she asked. "I had coffee," Lucas said, "and a protein bar around 7. "That's not food. That's what people eat when they're pretending they're too busy to eat actual food," Madison said. She broke her croissant in half and handed him part of it. "Eat!" Lucas took the piece of croissant without arguing, which suggested he was probably more depleted than he was admitting. "Thanks," he said. They sat together in companionable silence, watching the world move past the coffee shop window. Madison found herself thinking about how strange this all was. 2 weeks ago, this man had been a disruptive force in her library. 2 weeks ago, she would have been horrified to imagine sitting with him in a coffee shop, sharing pastries, allowing him to see her at less than optimal composure. "Can I tell you something?" Lucas asked suddenly. "And you can tell me if this is overstep, because I know I have a tendency toward overstep." Madison turned to look at him. "Yes, I'm glad the building's problems forced me to meet you," he said. He was looking out the window as he spoke, not at her, which somehow made it easier to listen. "I know that's probably weird to say when those problems are currently creating literal chaos in your workspace, but if the building had been in perfect condition, I probably would have just managed it remotely and never actually spent time here, and I would have missed knowing you." Madison did not know how to respond to this. She felt her heart do something unusual, not the alarming acceleration of panic or fear, but a kind of hopeful acceleration, a future-oriented acceleration. "That's not overstep," she said quietly. "I'm glad the building's problems forced me to know you too, even though you take phone calls in libraries and apparently have no concept of volume control." Lucas laughed. "I'm getting better about that, though. I've only taken 1 phone call inside Riverside in the last week, and that was because my contractor was having an emergency." "That's growth," Madison acknowledged. "I'm proud of you." The 30 minutes expired with surprising speed. They walked back toward the library, and Madison found herself walking slightly closer to Lucas than was strictly necessary, though she told herself this was merely because the sidewalk was occasionally crowded and she was maintaining a safe distance from pedestrian traffic. When they reached the library entrance, Lucas put his hand on her arm, just briefly, just enough to stop her from immediately entering. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with your stress, for letting me help." Madison nodded, not entirely trusting her voice. The rest of the day proceeded in much the way the morning had. The HVAC work continued. The library remained operational. Madison found that the break had genuinely helped. Her headache had diminished to something manageable, and her ability to assist patrons had returned to acceptable levels. By 1 o'clock, the construction crew packed up their equipment. By 1:30, they had left, leaving behind a trail of dust and the faint smell of industrial air filters. By 2 o'clock, Madison and Elena were doing a thorough cleaning of the circulation desk and work surfaces. At 2:15, Lucas appeared with a large bucket of cleaning supplies and the expression of someone who had made a unilateral decision. "What are you doing?" Madison asked. "Helping you clean," Lucas said. "This is my construction, my dust, my responsibility. You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," Lucas said, "but I want to. So let me." And so they cleaned together. Madison directing Lucas on organizational systems, Lucas physically accessing high shelves and corners that would have required Madison to use a stepladder. It was companionable work, the kind of thing that built a specific kind of intimacy through shared purpose. By 4 o'clock, the library was immaculate once more. By 4:15, Lucas was leaving to check on other buildings he was renovating, to consult with contractors about upcoming projects, to manage the various complications that came with being a business owner. Madison watched him go from the circulation desk, and she realized with some surprise that she was thinking about Thursday evening, when he would inevitably return to check on the HVAC installation or discuss the next phase of renovations. She was thinking about how much she was looking forward to seeing him. This was, she recognized, not a simple professional consideration. Over the following week, the renovations continued. The mechanical room was successfully updated. The electrical systems on the third floor were assessed and partially upgraded. The roof access was secured and prepared for the future garden installation that Lucas had designed with input from Madison. Each day, Lucas appeared at some point, sometimes to check on work progress, sometimes to consult with Madison about aesthetic choices, sometimes just to sit at the library tables and work from his laptop while staying near Madison's general vicinity. Madison found herself dressing slightly more carefully on days when she expected to see him. She found herself noticing things about him, the way he gestured when he was excited about a project, the particular tone he used when he was genuinely concerned about something, the fact that he always asked about her day before discussing his own. By Friday of that week, something had shifted. Madison could not identify the exact moment it had happened, but she recognized that the boundary between professional interaction with her landlord and something approaching romantic interest had become significantly blurred. And then, of course, the universe decided to complicate things by making Lucas fall through the floor. It was not, Madison would later clarify, actually falling through the floor. It was stepping on a piece of rotted subflooring in the basement mechanical room that had been weakened by water damage and giving way slightly, causing Lucas to drop approximately 8 inches into a gap between the current floor and the structural supports below. It was dramatic, and it was moderately painful, and it resulted in Lucas limping into the library at noon on Friday with a significantly swollen ankle and an expression of profound annoyance. "Don't," he said before Madison could even speak. "Don't tell me I need medical attention. I'm fine. It's just a sprain." "You should see a doctor," Madison said, ignoring his preemptive protestation. "Sprains can be serious. You could have damaged ligaments or—" "It's fine," Lucas insisted. "I've had worse. Remember when I told you about the time I fell off a scaffold in Seattle? This is nothing." "That doesn't make this okay," Madison said. She was already gathering her purse. "You're coming with me to the emergency clinic. Elena can cover the desk." "Madison, this is not negotiable," she said, in the tone she usually reserved for patrons who were violating noise regulations. "You are injured. Medical professionals should assess that injury. I'm taking you." She drove him to the emergency clinic on the east side of Portland, during which Lucas complained approximately 7 times about how unnecessary this was, while simultaneously leaning heavily on her as they walked from the car into the facility. The clinic was relatively quiet. It was Friday afternoon, not peak emergency time. They saw a nurse practitioner within 20 minutes, a competent woman in her 50s who examined Lucas's ankle with professional efficiency and delivered the diagnosis: severe ankle sprain, possible minor ligament damage, definitely not broken. "You're going to need to stay off it for at least a week," the nurse practitioner said. "Ice, elevation, anti-inflammatory medication. And honestly, you should probably have someone around to help with daily tasks. You're not going to want to be weight-bearing for the next few days." Lucas looked at Madison, apparently preparing to argue about this recommendation. Madison looked at Lucas and made a decision. "I can help," she said. "I can come by in the mornings before work and evenings after work. And I have tomorrow off, so I can spend Saturday with you." "You don't have to," Lucas began. "I know I don't have to," Madison said, "but I'm going to. What's your address?" Lucas provided his address, a converted loft in the Pearl district, which Madison filed away as additional data, suggesting that despite his blue-collar construction background, he had apparently inherited some of his father's sense of upscale real estate. She drove him there after they filled his prescription for pain medication, and she spent the evening arranging his apartment into something resembling an accessible layout for someone with a severely sprained ankle. His apartment was, she noted, not dissimilar from him, slightly disheveled but fundamentally organized, with art on the walls that suggested he actually thought about aesthetics rather than just defaulting to whatever came with the space. He had books scattered around, which Madison mentally catalogued as good sign. He had a kitchen that looked both used and respected. By 10 o'clock, she had ensured he was positioned on his couch, with his ankle elevated on pillows, with ice packs within arm's reach, with water and medication and food for the evening arranged on the side table. She had set up his laptop so he could work if he wanted to, without needing to walk around. She had essentially applied her entire organizational philosophy to the problem of injured Lucas. "Thank you," he said, as she was preparing to leave. "Seriously, you're kind of amazing, you know that?" "I'm efficient," Madison corrected. "Efficiency and kindness are not mutually exclusive, but let's not overstate it." "Your efficiency with a side of genuine care," Lucas said. "That's more than most people can manage." Madison drove home to her apartment, where she sat on her own couch and thought about the fact that she had, at some point in the last 2 weeks, developed actual romantic feelings for her landlord. This was not ideal. This was, in fact, professionally complicated and emotionally risky. On Saturday morning, she arrived at his apartment with grocery supplies, prepared to spend the day managing his recovery and simultaneously pretending this was a purely practical arrangement. By Saturday evening, after they had made homemade pasta together, with Lucas supervising from a chair while Madison cooked, and watched what Lucas insisted was a genuinely good movie, even though it was technically a romantic comedy, Madison had stopped trying to pretend anything. She was falling for him. There was no ambiguity. There was just the reality of a person who made her laugh, who respected her boundaries while gently pushing her to be slightly less rigid, who seemed genuinely interested in knowing the real version of her rather than the professional version or the polite version. And on Sunday morning, when she arrived to help him with breakfast and found him on crutches, limping toward the kitchen with the determination of someone who refused to be incapacitated, she realized that the feeling was probably mutual. "Don't," Lucas said before she could protest his weight-bearing. "I'm just making tea. I'm allowed to make tea." Madison watched him struggle with the kettle and the tea bags and the fundamental logistics of moving around a kitchen on crutches, and she felt something settle in her chest. She had spent years building a life that was controlled and safe and predictable, and now this man, loud, boundary-challenging, fundamentally chaotic, had arrived and disrupted all of that. And she was beginning to suspect that disruption might not be the worst thing that could happen. By Wednesday of Lucas's recovery week, Madison had essentially moved into his apartment. Not officially, her belongings remained in her own space, but practically. She arrived at 7 in the morning with coffee and breakfast. She stayed through the evening, managing medications, preparing meals, and pretending she wasn't acutely aware of every moment they occupied the same room. Lucas had stopped pretending around Tuesday. "You know this isn't necessary anymore, right?" he said, as Madison organized his kitchen for what felt like the 100th time. "I can walk on the ankle now. I'm basically functional." "You're supposed to be elevating it," Madison said, "not testing its weight-bearing capacity." "I'm testing it carefully," Lucas replied. "And Madison, I need to say something." She froze. This was the tone that preceded difficult conversations. "I like having you here," Lucas continued, "like, genuinely. But I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't want you staying because you think you should. I want you here because you want to be." Madison set down the container of leftover pasta she'd been organizing. "I am here because I want to be," she said carefully. "That's different from obligation." "Is it?" Lucas asked. He was sitting on his couch, ankle elevated, wearing the expression of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about something. "Because from my perspective, you're here out of a sense of responsibility, which is very you. But I don't want to be your responsibility. I want to be someone you choose to be around." This was, Madison realized, the vulnerability moment. The moment where she could either retreat into professional distance or acknowledge what had been building for 2 weeks. "You are," she said quietly. "You are someone I choose to be around. That's not responsibility. That's something else entirely." Lucas studied her for a long moment. "Then can we acknowledge that's something else?" he asked. "Because I'm pretty sure I'm falling for you, and I'm fairly certain you might be falling for me, and the pretending it's just professional is becoming exhausting." Madison sat down on the armchair across from him. She had spent 32 years perfecting emotional control, and now this man was asking her to abandon it. "I'm not good at this," she said finally. "Romantic relationships. I've had 2 significant relationships, and both ended because I'm too rigid, too organized, too resistant to spontaneity. I prioritize order over connection, and that doesn't work for most people." "I'm not most people," Lucas said, "and I like your order. I like that you're precise. I like that you think things through. I like you." Madison wanted to argue. She wanted to list the reasons this was complicated. That he was her landlord, that she was notoriously bad at relationships, that chaos followed him like a personal weather system. Instead, she said, "I like you too." Lucas smiled. "Okay then." "Okay then what?" Madison asked. "Okay then we acknowledge it," Lucas said. "We stop pretending this is just professional. We see where this goes." It should have been simple after that. It should have been straightforward. Feelings acknowledged, direction chosen, relationship parameters established. But then, on Friday morning, Madison arrived at the library to find her boss, Margaret, waiting in her office with an expression that suggested she had discovered something deeply troubling. "Sit," Margaret said. She was a woman in her 60s who had directed the Riverside Library for the past 8 years, and she was not usually one for dramatic announcements. Madison sat, her mind immediately cycling through potential disasters. Budget cuts, layoffs, policy violations, plague. "I received a communication from the building's new owner," Margaret said slowly. "Lucas Webb. He's concerned about the library's long-term viability in the building and wants to discuss restructuring our lease agreement." Madison's stomach dropped. "What kind of restructuring?" "That's what I need to understand," Margaret said. "And I need to understand it without bias. Is there a personal relationship between you and Lucas Webb?" Madison had spent her entire life believing she was incapable of lying convincingly. This moment proved her wrong because she said no with perfect composure despite her hands shaking. "Are you certain?" Margaret asked. "Because he's been here constantly for the past 2 weeks, and he seems very interested in your input on decisions. And staff have mentioned that you've been leaving early several days this week." "I've been helping with the renovations," Madison said. It was technically true. As the library's representative, building owner communication is part of my responsibility. Margaret studied her for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "But I need you to understand that if there is a personal relationship, you need to disclose it, particularly if it impacts library decisions or building policies." "There isn't," Madison repeated, and she felt something solidify in her chest. The moment when she chose professional security over emotional honesty. That evening, when she arrived at Lucas's apartment, he could apparently read every decision she'd made on her face. "What happened?" he asked immediately. "Margaret knows something is going on," Madison said, "or suspects. She asked directly if there was a personal relationship between us. And I said no," Madison said. She watched his expression shift from surprise to hurt to something more complicated. I couldn't tell her the truth. What if this affects my position? What if the library thinks I'm compromising my professional judgment? Are you compromising your professional judgment? Lucas asked quietly. No, Madison said, but the perception matters. The perception of me? Lucas asked. Or the perception of you? Madison didn't answer. She couldn't, because the honest answer was that she was protecting herself, her reputation, her carefully maintained professional image, which meant she was choosing her safety over his vulnerability. I understand, Lucas said, but his voice was careful, measured. But we can't keep pretending there's nothing happening. That's not fair to either of us. I know, Madison said. I just need time to figure out how to navigate this, how to be honest with my employer without jeopardizing my position. And how long will that take? Lucas asked. I don't know, Madison admitted. What followed was a week of uncomfortable compromise. They saw each other, but less frequently. They didn't touch in ways that suggested intimacy. They maintained professional distance in shared spaces. Madison attended building meetings and discussed renovation timelines with the same focus she used for library matters, treating Lucas as a contractor rather than a person she was falling for. It was awful. By the following Friday, Lucas reached a breaking point. This isn't working, he said, as Madison was preparing to leave his apartment after what had become a stilted, awkward evening. We're pretending we're not involved while being involved. We're asking each other for something we can't give. This is just creating distance. I know, Madison said. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Lucas said. Just decide. Either you want to be with me, actually with me, not secretly, or you don't, because this middle ground is just hurting us both. Madison left his apartment without answering, because she didn't have an answer that didn't require abandoning something essential to herself. And she spent the weekend alone in her apartment, surrounded by her organized spaces and her carefully controlled life, realizing that none of it felt meaningful without someone to share it with. Monday morning arrived, and Madison made a decision. Madison arrived at the library on Monday morning with a clarity that felt almost physical, the kind of certainty that comes after a weekend of complete internal honesty. She had spent Saturday and Sunday in her apartment, surrounded by her perfectly organized life, and realized that perfect organization without genuine connection was simply isolation with better filing systems. She called Margaret into her office at 9:30 after the initial morning rush had subsided. I need to tell you something, Madison said, and I want to be completely transparent because I value this position and I value the library, and I think you deserve honesty. Margaret settled into the chair across from Madison's desk with the expression of someone preparing for important information. All right. There is a personal relationship developing between me and Lucas Webb, Madison said. She had rehearsed this approximately 14 times over the weekend, and the words came out with the precision of someone who had prepared thoroughly. It began approximately 3 weeks ago when he became the building's owner. I didn't disclose it immediately because I was uncertain how it would impact my professional responsibilities, and I was concerned about the optics of the situation. Margaret waited, apparently sensing there was more. However, Madison continued, I have determined that maintaining secrecy is more damaging than transparency. Lucas and I have not made any decisions regarding building policy or library operations based on personal feelings. All building-related decisions have been made with consideration for the library's best interests. But I understand that you need to assess whether my judgment is compromised. Is it? Margaret asked directly. Madison considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. In some ways, yes, she said. I am more inclined to trust Lucas's judgment about building matters because I trust him as a person. In other ways, no. I have advocated for the library's needs clearly, and Lucas has respected those needs, even when they might be less convenient for his renovation timeline. So it's complicated. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. I appreciate the honesty, and I appreciate that you're thinking clearly about the complications. What do you want to happen? I want to continue my work here, Madison said. And I want to explore the relationship with Lucas. I want to be transparent about both of those things. If the library has a policy against relationships with building owners or landlords, I want to understand that policy and determine whether there's a conflict. We don't have such a policy, Margaret said. The assumption was always that our staff are professional enough to navigate these situations, but I appreciate that you're taking it seriously. She paused. For what it's worth, I've been watching you for the past 2 weeks. You've seemed unhappy, stressed in a way that goes beyond work stress. I'm glad you're addressing it. Madison felt something release in her chest. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Thank you, she said. Now, Margaret continued, what are you going to do about Lucas? After leaving Margaret's office, Madison sent Lucas a text message. Can we talk today? After work? His response came within minutes. Yes. My place? 6 p.m.? Madison spent the entire workday in a state of heightened awareness. Every decision, every interaction, every moment felt significant because it was leading toward a conversation that might change everything. She helped patrons with their research queries. She organized the new book donations. She processed returns with her usual precision. But underneath it all, she was thinking about Lucas, about the way he listened, about the way he made her feel less alone, about the way he had respected her need for space, while making it clear that space wasn't what he actually wanted. At 5:45, she closed the library and drove to his apartment in the Pearl District. The evening was cool and slightly overcast, the kind of autumn evening that made Portland's architecture look particularly cinematic. Lucas's building was a converted warehouse with tall windows and exposed brick, the kind of space that suggested someone who appreciated history and transformation. He answered the door before she could knock, which suggested he'd been waiting. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," Madison replied. She stepped inside his apartment, which smelled like coffee and the particular comfort of a familiar space. "I told Margaret about us." Lucas's expression shifted through several iterations: surprise, concern, hope. How did she respond? "She was supportive," Madison said. "She pointed out that she's noticed I've been unhappy, and she was glad I was addressing it. She also clarified that the library doesn't have a policy against relationships with building owners, so there's no structural barrier to us being together." "Madison," Lucas said slowly, "are you saying—" "I'm saying that I spent the weekend thinking about my life," Madison interrupted, "and I realized that I've spent the last decade optimizing for control and safety and professional reputation. And all of that is valuable, but it's not enough. It's not actually living, it's just managing. And you showed me that life doesn't have to be perfectly ordered to be meaningful, that sometimes chaos and spontaneity and genuine connection matter more than perfect systems." Lucas stepped closer. "I'm still going to be loud sometimes," he said, "and disorganized, and probably annoying in ways you haven't discovered yet." "I know," Madison said, "and I'm still going to be rigid and overplanned and probably exhausting, but I think we work. Not in spite of being different, but because of it." "So what are you saying?" Lucas asked. "I'm saying," Madison said carefully, "that I want to try. Actually try. Not secretly try. I want to be with you, if you still want to be with me." Lucas reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid and real. "I have wanted to be with you since approximately the moment you told me to keep my voice down in the mezzanine," he said, "and I'm going to want to be with you for a very long time." He kissed her then, and it was exactly what Madison had been afraid of and hoping for simultaneously. It was real and imperfect and genuinely felt rather than carefully calculated. It was the opposite of everything she had trained herself to believe about control and safety. It was exactly what she needed. When they pulled apart, Madison was aware that she was smiling in a way that probably made her look somewhat foolish. She didn't particularly care. I should tell you something, Lucas said, keeping her hand in his. About why I was here at the library that first day, before we officially met. What? Madison asked. I was visiting the building to assess the space before purchasing it, Lucas said, and I heard you speaking to someone on the phone. I think it was a vendor, and you were so patient and clear and organized, even when they were being difficult. And I thought, I want to work with that person, I want to know that person. And then, immediately afterward, I made a phone call and got shushed, which was apparently the universe's way of introducing us. That's a very romantic version of events, Madison said. The actual version involved you being disruptive and me being judgmental. We were both exactly who we needed to be, Lucas said. You needed to learn that not everything requires perfect control. I needed to learn that some things deserve respect and attention. We taught each other. They spent the evening in his apartment, cooking together, with Lucas assisting from a stool, his ankle still slightly weak but significantly improved, talking about the future, discussing what transparency with Margaret actually meant for their working relationship. By the time Madison left to return to her own apartment, something fundamental had shifted. She had chosen vulnerability over safety. She had chosen connection over control. She had chosen Lucas. Tuesday morning, Madison arrived at the library and noticed something she hadn't consciously registered before. The building was beautiful. The classical revival architecture, the original hardwood, the tall windows that let in afternoon light, all of it was genuinely beautiful. And now she knew the person who owned it, who was investing in restoring it, who was trying to preserve something historical and meaningful. At 10 o'clock, Lucas arrived with coffee and the expression of someone who was genuinely happy. "Good morning, Library Madison," he said, approaching the circulation desk in a way that was now clearly flirtatious rather than disruptive. "Good morning, Lucas," Madison replied. Several patrons glanced up, apparently sensing that something had shifted in the dynamic. "What brings you by?" "I wanted to discuss the rooftop garden timeline," Lucas said. It was a perfectly reasonable professional question, delivered with absolutely no professional tone. "And possibly take you to lunch, if you have time." Madison considered the circulation desk, the open library, the patrons who might need assistance. Then she thought about the weekend she'd spent alone, about the week she'd spent pretending, about the years she'd spent prioritizing order over connection. "Elena," she called to her part-time staff member, "can you cover the desk for 1 hour?" "Of course," Elena said, with the kind of knowing smile that suggested the entire library staff had apparently been aware of something developing between Madison and Lucas. They went to lunch at a small Italian restaurant 2 blocks away. They sat in a corner booth and talked about the rooftop garden, and about Lucas's business expansion plans, and about how Madison was considering pursuing a master's degree in library science, something she'd abandoned years ago, out of a belief that she didn't have time for additional education. By the time they returned to the library, Madison felt something she hadn't felt in years. Genuinely happy, not satisfied in a controlled way, not content in a carefully managed way, actually genuinely happy. The following 2 weeks passed in a kind of beautiful blur. The renovations continued. Lucas's ankle healed. Madison and Lucas became an acknowledged couple in the library and the building. They held hands in shared spaces. They had lunch together. They were openly affectionate in a way that was respectful but undeniably romantic. The rooftop garden began to take shape. Lucas hired a landscape designer who worked with both of them to create a space that felt peaceful but not rigid, beautiful but accessible. There were raised garden beds, which Madison appreciated for their organized structure. And there were also wildflower sections, which Lucas appreciated for their beautiful chaos. By the time the final pieces of the renovation were complete, by the time the building inspection passed and the library received clearance to remain operational without restrictions, Madison realized that her life had fundamentally transformed. She still believed in organization and structure. She still valued silence and control. But she also believed in spontaneity and connection and the beautiful chaos that came with loving another person. On a Thursday evening, as the sun was setting over Portland, Madison and Lucas sat on the newly completed rooftop garden. There were comfortable chairs and soft lighting, and the view of the city was spectacular. "I have something to tell you," Lucas said. He took her hand. "Something I've been thinking about for a while." Madison's heart accelerated in a way that suggested her body knew what her mind was still processing. "I love you," he said simply, "and I know we've only been officially together for a few weeks, but I've been falling for you since the moment you told me to keep my voice down, and I'm going to keep falling for you for a very long time. And I wanted you to know that." Madison turned to look at him, this man who had disrupted her carefully ordered life and somehow made it infinitely more meaningful. "I love you too," she said, "even though you take phone calls inappropriately, even though you have no concept of volume control, even though you've made my life significantly less organized." "I know," Lucas said, and he was smiling. "And you love me anyway. That's the thing about love. It's not about being perfect or compatible in every way. It's about choosing each other despite imperfection. It's about someone disrupting your life and making it better for the disruption." Madison leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together watching the city lights come on as darkness settled around them. The library was closed below them. The building was quiet, but instead of feeling lonely, the quiet felt companionable, the kind of silence that two people could share without needing to fill it with words. "Thank you," Madison said finally. "For what?" Lucas asked. "For being loud in the library," she said, "for disrupting my life, for making me understand that perfection is less important than connection." "Thank you for shushing me," Lucas replied, "for holding me accountable, for teaching me that some things deserve respect and attention." The evening deepened around them, and the Portland skyline glittered with the lights of a city full of stories. And in that moment, Madison understood that the best stories weren't the ones where everything proceeded according to plan. They were the ones where two people found each other despite their differences, where chaos and order collided and created something unexpectedly beautiful. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in late spring, Madison stood in the library's main floor and tried to convince herself that she wasn't nervous. This was illogical. She had given public presentations before. She was comfortable speaking to groups. She had no reason to experience the particular brand of anxiety that comes from doing something genuinely meaningful. But this was different. Today was the official reopening celebration of Riverside Library. And more importantly, today was the day Madison was going to announce her engagement to Lucas in front of approximately 300 people, including her family, his family, and essentially everyone they knew. "You look like you might hyperventilate," Elena said, adjusting the small bouquet of wildflowers that Madison was holding. The flowers came from the rooftop garden, a deliberate choice, a symbol of the wild growth that had happened in Madison's life over the past 6 months. "I'm not going to hyperventilate," Madison said, but her hands were shaking slightly. "I'm simply experiencing normal pre-announcement anxiety." "You're going to be fine," Elena assured her. "Lucas is probably more nervous than you are." This was, in fact, true. Madison could see Lucas from where she was standing. He was near the circulation desk, adjusting his tie for approximately the 100th time, talking to his sister Catherine with the intensity of someone who wanted everything to be perfect. The library had transformed since the renovations began. The original hardwood floors had been refinished and gleamed under the restored brass lighting fixtures. New shelving had been installed in a way that honored the building's historical aesthetic while adding modern functionality. The mezzanine had been reinforced and improved. Climate control was optimal. Everything was, in Madison's professional assessment, perfect. But more importantly, the library felt alive in a way it hadn't before. There was a sense of possibility, of transformation, of something broken being restored and made beautiful again. which, Madison reflected, was essentially the story of her relationship with Lucas as well. Margaret appeared at Madison's side, looking genuinely delighted. Over the past 6 months, Margaret had become something of a romantic ally. She had given Madison schedule flexibility when needed, had supported the library's expansion plans that aligned with Lucas's vision for the building, and had apparently become deeply invested in whether Madison and Lucas would actually make their relationship permanent. "He's going to propose," Margaret said. "It wasn't a question. We're going to propose," Madison corrected. "I proposed first, actually, 3 weeks ago. He said yes, but then he wanted to do his own proposal in front of everyone because he's apparently sentimental and believes in grand gestures." "And you're okay with that?" Margaret asked. "I'm terrified," Madison admitted. "But yes, I'm okay with it. I've learned that not everything needs to be planned perfectly in advance. Some things are better when they're slightly spontaneous and genuinely felt." Margaret squeezed her hand. "You've changed," she said, "in a good way. You're still organized and thorough, but you're also present. You're actually happy now." At noon, Margaret called everyone to gather in the library's main space. Approximately 300 people filled the room. Patrons, staff, building tenants, Madison's family. Her parents had driven from Iowa. Her siblings had come from various parts of the country. Lucas's family. His father was here, which Madison knew had been complicated for Lucas, along with Catherine and their mother. Margaret gave a short speech about the library's history and its renovation. She talked about preservation and transformation. She talked about community spaces and the people who dedicate themselves to maintaining those spaces. And then she introduced Madison. Madison stepped forward, and her voice was steady when she spoke. She talked about what the library meant to her, about the importance of quiet spaces in an increasingly loud world, about the ways that community institutions shaped lives. She talked about change and growth and the courage required to let go of perfection in favor of authenticity. "And then," Madison said, "I met someone who taught me that sometimes disruption leads to transformation. That sometimes the loudest person in the room can help you understand that silence alone isn't enough. That sometimes the person who breaks all your rules is exactly the person you need." She looked directly at Lucas as she said this, and she watched his expression shift from nervous to tender. "Lucas Webb," Madison continued, "you came into my library and disrupted everything I thought I wanted. And I'm grateful for that disruption. I'm grateful for you, and I want to spend my life with you in all your loud, chaotic, beautiful glory." And then she pulled out the ring, a vintage platinum band with a modest diamond, something she'd selected because it was elegant but unpretentious, organized but not rigid. "Will you marry me?" she asked. There was a moment of absolute silence. And then Lucas laughed, that same big, unrestrained laugh that had echoed through the library that first day, and he nodded emphatically. "Yes," he said. "Yes, absolutely yes." He pulled her into a kiss that was undignified and public and entirely appropriate for someone who had no concept of volume control or social boundaries. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. But then, when they separated, Lucas pulled out his own ring, a delicate band that he'd apparently been carrying around for the past 3 weeks, waiting for this moment. "I was going to do a whole elaborate thing," he said to Madison, loud enough for everyone to hear, "but you've never been good with elaborate, so instead I'm just going to say that I love you for being exactly who you are, for being rigid and organized and obsessed with library etiquette, for teaching me that respecting boundaries is actually romantic, and for somehow, inexplicably, loving me back." He placed the ring on her finger, and Madison looked down at the two bands together, hers and his side by side, complementary rather than identical. Later, after the formal celebration had concluded, after Madison's mother had cried happy tears and Lucas's father had made a surprisingly touching speech about accepting people's choices even when they're different from what you expected, after 300 people had consumed cake and celebrated the library's reopening, Madison and Lucas found themselves alone on the rooftop garden. The spring evening was perfect, warm but not hot, clear but with enough clouds to make the sunset interesting. The garden was fully established now, with flowering plants and carefully arranged seating areas and the kind of peaceful aesthetic that came from combining structure with natural growth. "Hi," Lucas said, taking her hand. "We're engaged." "We are," Madison confirmed. "This is either the best decision I've ever made or a catastrophic mistake that will eventually result in mutual frustration and regret." "Optimistic as always," Lucas said, laughing. "But I think we're going to be fine. I think we're actually going to be more than fine." "How can you be so certain?" Madison asked. "Because I've watched you for the past 6 months," Lucas said. "I've watched you learn to be spontaneous without losing your ability to be organized. I've watched you defend the library's needs while supporting my renovation vision. I've watched you become someone who can hold complexity, who can be both rigid and flexible, both certain and open to change. That's the kind of person who builds a lasting relationship." They sat together in the growing darkness, watching the city lights come on across Portland. Madison thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, perfectly ordered, emotionally contained, believing that the best life was one where everything stayed the same and nothing disrupted the carefully maintained status quo. And then she thought about who she was now, still organized, still thoughtful, still committed to the library and to precision, but also open to chaos, willing to be surprised, capable of loving someone who fundamentally challenged her assumptions about what a good life looked like. "I have something to tell you," Madison said. "I'm listening," Lucas replied. "I've decided to pursue my master's degree," Madison said, "in library science and archival studies. I'm going to apply for full admission, and I want to do it while continuing to work here. It's ambitious and probably somewhat impractical, and it might create scheduling complications, but I want to do it anyway." Lucas grinned. "That's amazing," he said. "And also very you, taking on an ambitious project with meticulous planning. With the understanding that plans are flexible," Madison added. "If something needs to change, we'll figure it out." "Look at you," Lucas said. "Growth and everything." Over the following year, Riverside Library became something of a Portland institution, not just as a library, but as an example of thoughtful historic preservation done right. Local news outlets ran features on the renovation. Architecture students came to study the building, and Madison, in her role as head librarian, became increasingly known for her innovative approach to community programming. She started a Quiet Spaces initiative that created designated areas for people who needed respite from sensory overwhelm. She began an archival project documenting Portland's history. She mentored 3 new librarians who showed up to work inspired by her dedication to the profession. And through it all, Lucas managed his construction business, oversaw the building's maintenance, and came to the library regularly, ostensibly to check on various systems, actually just to see Madison. He never stopped being loud. He never stopped taking phone calls occasionally, though he had improved significantly. He never stopped challenging her to be a little less rigid, to take a few more risks, to understand that life wasn't just about preservation, but also about growth. In September, Madison started her master's program. In November, she and Lucas got married in a small ceremony at the library, in the rooftop garden naturally, with exactly 42 guests. Madison had suggested a more modest guest list, but Lucas had lobbied for including several contractors and friends, and she had eventually accepted the compromise. Her dress was elegant and structured, selected with careful attention to detail. His suit was well fitted, but somehow still managed to look slightly disheveled, which seemed very much like him. Her bouquet was organized by type and color. His boutonniere was a wildflower from the rooftop garden. They wrote their own vows. Madison's were precise and beautiful and included a specific acknowledgement of the structural integrity that Lucas provided to her life. Lucas's were more emotional and rambling and included at least 3 tangents before returning to the central theme that he loved her and would keep loving her even when she reorganized his tools. By the time they kissed as a married couple, with the Portland skyline visible behind them and the rooftop garden surrounding them, Madison understood something fundamental. She had spent the first 32 years of her life believing that perfection meant control. But actual perfection, the kind that mattered, meant partnership. It meant choosing someone who challenged you. It meant accepting disruption as a form of growth. 2 years after that first day in the library, when Lucas had laughed too loudly in the mezzanine, Madison stood at the circulation desk and helped a new patron find materials on architectural history. The patron was young, probably early 20s, with an uncertain expression that Madison recognized as someone new to research. "Are you looking for something specific?" Madison asked in her librarian voice, the voice that was kind but professional, welcoming but clear. "I'm trying to understand the history of preserved buildings," the patron said. "Like how buildings survive and get restored and stay relevant even when everything else changes." Madison smiled. "That's actually a fascinating topic," she said, "and I happen to have some expertise in that area. Let me show you where we keep those materials." As she led the patron toward the reference section, she passed the window where she could see the rooftop garden. Lucas was up there. She could see him consulting with the landscape designer about summer plantings. He was gesturing emphatically, probably being loud about whatever point he was making. She could also see the mechanical room through a different window, the HVAC system that he had replaced, the structural improvements he had made, the quiet infrastructure that kept the building functioning. And she understood that the building was a metaphor, which would have made Lucas groan if she said it out loud, but it was. The beautiful visible parts, the flowers, the architecture, the people, couldn't exist without the systems that supported them, the HVAC, the electrical work, the quiet maintenance that nobody noticed. Similarly, a life couldn't be sustained on order alone, nor could it survive on chaos alone. It required both, the structure and the spontaneity, the planning and the flexibility, the silence and the sound. That evening, Madison and Lucas went to dinner at their favorite restaurant. They talked about his latest renovation project, a historic house in southeast Portland. They talked about her thesis research, which had evolved into a broader examination of how community spaces adapt to changing needs. They held hands across the table and laughed about something that probably wasn't that funny, but felt funny because they were together. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked suddenly. "Like the chaos, the disruption? Do you ever miss having your life completely organized?" Madison considered this honestly. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When you reorganize my filing system without consulting me, I experience genuine frustration. When you commit to social plans without checking our calendar, I feel mildly panicked. When you leave your construction plans scattered across the coffee table, I want to create a filing system specifically for them." "So yes, you regret it," Lucas said. "No," Madison corrected, "because then I remember that you make me laugh more than I thought was possible, that you've shown me how to be spontaneous without losing myself. That you chose me, not the organized version or the rigid version, but the actual complicated version. That's not something I regret. That's something I'm grateful for." "Good," Lucas said, "because I'm not changing. I'm still going to be loud and disorganized and probably infuriating. But I'm also going to love you, and I'm going to keep trying to be better because you matter to me." "I know," Madison said. And I'm still going to be rigid and overplanned and probably exhausting, but I'm also going to love you, and I'm going to keep trying to embrace a little more spontaneity because you matter to me. They left the restaurant and walked through the Portland evening. The building that had started all of this, the Riverside building, was lit up in the distance, its classical architecture glowing in the streetlights. The library would close soon, would go dark and quiet, would be a space of silence until morning returned. But tonight, it was full of people. Madison had glimpsed them through the windows as they walked past. People studying, people researching, people just existing in the quiet sanctuary that she and Lucas had worked together to preserve and transform. "Thank you," Madison said to Lucas as they walked. "For what?" he asked. "For breaking my silence," Madison said. "For disrupting everything. For making me understand that the best stories aren't the quiet ones. They're the ones where someone loud and imperfect and beautiful enters your life and makes everything different." Lucas pulled her close. "Thank you for telling me to keep my voice down," he replied. "For teaching me that some things deserve respect. For building a life with me that's both ordered and chaotic and absolutely real." They walked home together through the Portland night. Two people who had started as fundamentally incompatible and had become genuinely necessary to each other, not because they had changed who they were, but because they had chosen to see each other's differences as strengths rather than weaknesses. And the Riverside Library, standing proud and restored and alive with possibility, continued its quiet work of preserving knowledge and creating community. A perfect metaphor for a marriage that balanced silence with sound, structure with spontaneity, the past with the future.